The rifle cracked once, and 400 yards downrange a German scout officer pitched backward into the snow without a sound. The second crack came 3 seconds later, and another Feldwebel collapsed beside a farmhouse wall, his binoculars still pressed to his face. By the time the third shot echoed across the frozen valley, panic had seized the entire reconnaissance patrol, men scattering for cover that didn't exist, while a lone rifleman they couldn't see systematically dismantled their formation with a weapon their own high command had dismissed as unsuitable for modern warfare. The year was 1944, and Corporal Matthias Brenner was proving that sometimes the most devastating weapon on a battlefield isn't the one designed by engineers in laboratories, but the one carried by a man who refuses to accept what's supposed to be impossible. The Vosges Mountains in eastern France had become a frozen hell by December 1944. The Allied advance that swept through France after D-Day had ground to a brutal, exhausting crawl against the Wehrmacht defensive lines anchored in the forested ridges and narrow valleys along the Franco-German border. This wasn't the kind of warfare anyone had planned for or wanted. It was close-range, intimate, brutal fighting where visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred yards because of terrain, weather, and the dense coniferous forest that covered the mountains like a dark blanket. Artillery was limited by the steep slopes and the difficulty of spotting targets through the canopy. Armor was nearly useless on roads that turned to ice and mud simultaneously, and on grades too steep for tanks to safely traverse. Infantry bore the weight of every yard gained, every position held, every ridge contested. It was a kind of war where small advantages mattered enormously, where individual skill could shift the balance of an engagement, and where innovation born of desperation often outperformed doctrine born of planning. Matthias Brenner wasn't supposed to be there at all. He was 38 years old in December 1944, far beyond the age when Germany still had the luxury of being selective about who carried a rifle. He'd been a forester before the war, managing timber operations in the Schwarzwald region, a man who spent more time alone in deep woods than in towns or cities. His world had been defined by the rhythms of seasons, the management of sustainable harvests, the tracking of game populations, and the solitary satisfaction of work that required patience, observation, and an almost intuitive understanding of how forests functioned as living systems. He'd learned to shoot as a boy, taught by his grandfather who'd fought in the Franco-Prussian War, and who believed that a German man should know his forest and know his rifle with equal competence. By the time Matthias was 20, he could track a red deer through dense undergrowth by the faintest disturbances in leaf litter, could estimate range by the clarity of detail in what he observed, and could place a bullet precisely where he intended at distances that made other hunters shake their heads in disbelief. But marksmanship and forest craft weren't qualities the Wehrmacht prioritized in 1939 when the war began. Matthias was too old for the first waves of conscription, and his work as a forester was classified as essential to the war economy. Timber meant pit props for coal mines, construction materials for fortifications, fuel for a nation increasingly short of coal and oil. He spent the first 5 years of the war doing what he'd always done, managing forests, training younger men to do the work before they were conscripted, and watching his country descend into a nightmare he couldn't reconcile with the quiet, orderly life he'd known. By 1944, Germany was scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves. Men in their late 30s and early 40s, men previously considered too old or too essential, were being pulled into military service as casualties mounted and the frontiers contracted. In September 1944, Matthias received his conscription notice. 6 weeks of abbreviated training followed, barely enough to teach him how to wear the uniform properly, how to follow orders, and how to operate the standard-issue weapons of a German infantryman. Then he was shipped to the Vosges with a replacement battalion tasked with reinforcing the 19th Army's defensive positions against the American advance. The weapon they issued him was a Carabiner 98K, the standard German infantry rifle, a design dating back to the 1930s, and refined from earlier Mauser actions going back to the 1890s. It was a solid, reliable bolt-action rifle, accurate enough for its intended purpose of equipping millions of infantrymen with a weapon that can engage targets out to 400 or 500 meters in trained hands. But Matthias, the moment they placed it in his hands during training, recognized its limitations. The action was robust, but slow for rapid follow-up shots. The sights were adequate, but not precise. The trigger pull was heavy and inconsistent, designed for durability and ease of manufacture rather than the crisp break a precision shooter required. For mass infantry combat, where volume of fire and reliability under terrible conditions mattered more than precision, the K98K was perfectly adequate. For a man who'd spent 20 years shooting custom hunting rifles built to tolerances that commercial gunsmiths lavished on wealthy clients, the K98K felt like a crude approximation of what a rifle should be. Matthias said nothing during training. Complaining would accomplish nothing, and drawing attention to himself served no purpose. He learned the manual of arms, qualified as expert with the K98K, despite its limitations, and kept his thoughts to himself. But when the training cycle ended and they were given a brief leave before deployment, Matthias went home to the Schwarzwald. He told his wife he needed to collect personal items, which was true but incomplete. What he actually needed was in a locked cabinet in his workshop. His hunting rifle, a custom Mauser action built in 1936 by a gunsmith in Freiburg who'd catered to wealthy hunters and competitive shooters. The rifle was chambered in 7x57mm Mauser, a cartridge with ballistics similar to the 7.92 by 57mm used in the K98K, but with a reputation for exceptional accuracy. The rifle itself was a work of functional art, a hand-fitted action with a trigger that broke like glass at exactly 2 pounds of pressure, a barrel that had been hand-lapped to eliminate microscopic imperfections, and sights that could be adjusted with precision down to individual minutes of angle. Matthias had used this rifle to take Red Stag at 300 meters to win regional shooting competitions, and to maintain his skills during the long winters when forestry work slowed. It was, without question, the finest rifle he'd ever touched. Taking it to the front was technically against regulations. Soldiers were supposed to carry issued weapons, use issued ammunition, and maintain standardization for logistical reasons that made perfect sense in theory. But Matthias had seen enough of the war by then to understand that regulations written by staff officers in Berlin had limited relevance in frozen mountains where survival depended on practical effectiveness rather than bureaucratic compliance. He disassembled the rifle, packed it in a canvas bag with 200 rounds of hand-loaded 7x57mm ammunition he prepared over the years, and smuggled it east when he returned from leave. His plan was simple: carry the issued K98K for inspections and routine duties, but when situations required precision shooting, use the rifle that could actually deliver it. Whether his squad leader or company officers would tolerate this depended entirely on whether it worked, and Matthias was confident it would work because he'd spent 2 decades making rifles work at distances and in conditions where failure meant going home empty-handed. The first test came in late October, 3 weeks after Matthias arrived at the front. His unit, a reinforced infantry company, was holding a defensive position along a ridgeline overlooking a valley that the Americans needed to cross to continue their advance. The tactical situation was straightforward. The Americans would probe with reconnaissance elements to identify German positions and strength, then bring up artillery and infantry to assault whatever they found. The German mission was to delay that process as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, and withdraw before being overrun. Standard defensive doctrine for an army that no longer had the strength to hold ground indefinitely. The problem was that American reconnaissance was cautious and professional. They used terrain expertly, moved in small groups that were hard to target with machine guns or mortars, and stayed at ranges where German riflemen struggled to achieve hits with iron-sighted K98K rifles. For 3 days, Matthias watched American scouts observe German positions from 400 to 600 meters away, safely beyond the effective range of harassing fire, gathering information that would inevitably lead to artillery strikes and infantry assaults. On the 4th day, Matthias asked his squad leader, an exhausted Feldwebel named Vogel who'd been fighting since 1941, for permission to try something different. Vogel, who'd seen enough of the war to know that doctrine was less important than results, asked what Matthias had in mind. Matthias showed him the hunting rifle. Vogel stared at it for a long moment, then asked if Matthias could actually hit anything at the ranges where the American scouts were operating. Matthias said he could, and he could prove it if Vogel would give him 2 rounds to demonstrate. Vogel, who had nothing to lose and who was tired of watching Americans operate with impunity, agreed. The next time an American scout team appeared on a distant hillside, Matthias took up a position behind a fallen log that provided stable support, ranged the target approximately 450 meters by comparing the apparent size of the men to terrain features he'd paced off, adjusted his sight accordingly, controlled his breathing, and fired. The first scout dropped instantly. The second scout, frozen in shock, dropped 4 seconds later when Matthias worked his bolt and fired again. The rest of the team vanished into dead ground so fast it was almost comical. Vogel, watching through binoculars, said nothing for several seconds. Then he told Matthias that if he could keep doing that, nobody would ask questions about what rifle he was carrying. Word spread quickly through the company and then the battalion. Within a week, Matthias had become the designated counter-sniper and scout hunter for his sector of the line. His routine became grimly consistent. Identify American reconnaissance elements attempting to observe German positions, range them carefully using techniques he developed over 20 years of hunting in complex terrain, and engage them at distances where they felt safe from German riflemen. The psychological effect was immediate and significant. American reconnaissance became more cautious, stayed farther back, spent less time observing, and accomplished less. German positions remained ambiguous to American intelligence, which meant American attacks came in less prepared, struck less effectively, and could be repulsed with fewer casualties. Matthias's company commander, a captain named Stahl who'd been an artillery officer before being transferred to infantry command due to personnel shortages, recognized what was happening and gave Matthias extraordinary freedom to operate as he saw fit. By mid-November, Matthias had 17 confirmed kills, all of them scouts, forward observers, or reconnaissance personnel killed at ranges between 350 and 550 meters. Each kill represented not just one American casualty, but a degradation of American intelligence gathering and tactical preparation. Stahl estimated that Matthias's shooting had delayed American advances in their sector by at least a week, which in the grinding attrition of the Vosges represented a significant tactical success. But the effect on Matthias himself was profound and troubling in ways he struggled to articulate. Hunting deer was one thing. The animal never knew it was being hunted until the bullet arrived, and there was no moral dimension beyond the ethics of clean kills and sustainable harvest. Hunting men was entirely different. Each time Matthias settled behind his rifle, ranged a distant figure, and pressed the trigger, he was making a conscious decision to end a life. To kill someone who likely had no idea they were in danger, to inflict on some American family the same kind of loss that German families were experiencing by the millions. He told himself that this was war, that these men were enemies, that every American he killed might be one fewer to kill German soldiers in the next engagement. But the rationalizations fell hollow in the quiet moments between actions, and Matthias found himself sleeping less, smoking more, and withdrawing into a silence that his squad mates interpreted as a natural reserve of a forester accustomed to solitude. The killing that changed everything happened on November 18th. Matthias had identified an American observation post on a hillside approximately 480 meters from his position. 2 men were visible, one using binoculars to scan German lines, the other taking notes or making calculations. Standard forward observer procedure. Matthias ranged them carefully, adjusted for a slight crosswind he could feel on his face, and fired. The first man dropped. The second man, instead of diving for cover, stood up fully exposed and stared in the direction of Matthias's position, apparently unable to process what had just happened. Matthias had a clear shot, an easy shot by his standards, but for 3 or 4 seconds he didn't take it. He watched this American soldier stand there, silhouetted against the sky, looking toward death he couldn't see, and Matthias felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of revulsion at what he was doing. Then training and instinct overrode conscience, and he fired. The American dropped, and Matthias immediately displaced to a secondary position, as doctrine required. But the sick feeling in his stomach didn't displace with him. That night he barely spoke, barely ate, and when Vogel asked if he was all right, Matthias said he was fine and walked away before the conversation could continue. But the killing continued because the tactical situation demanded it. By early December, American forces were preparing for a major offensive to break through the Vosges and reach the Rhine plain beyond. Intelligence gathering intensified. American reconnaissance became more aggressive, probing German lines constantly to identify weak points, assess defensive strength, and locate artillery and machine gun positions. Matthias found himself shooting nearly every day, sometimes multiple times per day, engaging targets at ranges that pushed even his rifle's capabilities. He developed techniques to maximize effectiveness. He identified multiple firing positions and rotated between them to avoid counter-battery fire. He studied American reconnaissance patterns to anticipate where scouts would appear. He learned to distinguish officers from enlisted men by subtle differences in bearing and equipment. And he prioritized officers because killing leadership degraded unit effectiveness more than killing riflemen. By December 10th, his confirmed kill count had reached 31, and his reputation had spread beyond his own battalion. German soldiers and adjacent units knew about the Forester with the hunting rifle, who was killing Americans at impossible distances. American forces in the sector knew someone was targeting their scouts with uncanny precision, and had started referring to him in intelligence reports as the hunter, based on speculation from German prisoners that a Forester was responsible. The climax came on December 14th during the opening phase of the American offensive. Matthias's unit was holding a critical position on a ridge that overlooked the primary American axis of advance. The American plan, which German intelligence had partially pieced together through prisoner interrogation and document capture, involved a dawn artillery barrage followed by infantry assault supported by armor on the few roads capable of supporting tanks. The German plan was to hold as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, and withdraw before being encircled. Simple, brutal, and realistic given the force ratios involved. The artillery barrage began at 0530 hours, a thundering cascade of high explosive and white phosphorus that turned the ridge into a hellscape of shattered trees, cratered earth, and smoke so thick it was difficult to breathe. Matthias and his squad sheltered in a bunker they dug and reinforced over preceding weeks, waiting for barrage to lift and the infantry assault to begin. When the barrage finally shifted the targets deeper in the German rear, Matthias emerged to find a landscape transformed into something from a nightmare. Trees stripped to splintered stumps, earth churned into mud despite freezing temperatures, and visibility reduced to less than 100 meters by lingering smoke and morning fog. Then the fog began to lift, and Matthias saw them, an American reconnaissance element, approximately 12 men, moving up the slope toward German positions to confirm that the artillery had done its job and the way was clear for the main assault. They were advancing cautiously but not fearfully, clearly expecting that any German still alive would be too stunned and disorganized to mount effective resistance. They were wrong. Matthias took up a position behind the remnants of a shattered bunker, rested his rifle on a stable surface, and began engaging at approximately 380 meters. The first shot killed the point man. The second shot killed the squad leader, who stood up to assess the situation. The third shot killed a radio man trying to call for support. Panic seized the American element. They scattered, seeking cover that the artillery had largely destroyed, and Matthias methodically engaged each man he could see. His rifle, maintained obsessively despite the terrible conditions, functioned flawlessly. His ammunition, hand-loaded to precise specifications, performed exactly as he designed it to. His skill, honed over decades and refined by months of combat, was at its peak. In approximately 4 minutes, Matthias engaged 10 targets and achieved 9 confirmed kills and 1 probable. The surviving Americans retreated down the slope, and the main assault on that sector was delayed for 3 hours, while American commanders tried to understand what had just happened and how a single rifleman had destroyed an entire reconnaissance squad. That engagement brought Matthias's total confirmed kills to 40, though he himself had stopped counting at 36 and only knew the number because Vogel kept track. It also brought him to the attention of higher command levels than a corporal normally reached. That evening, despite ongoing combat, Matthias was summoned to battalion headquarters, where a major he'd never met informed him that he was being recommended for the Iron Cross First Class, and that division had requested a report on his techniques for potential dissemination to other units. The major asked Matthias how he'd achieved such results. Matthias, exhausted and hollowed out by months of killing, gave a brief technical explanation. Superior rifle, superior ammunition, superior understanding of ballistics and wind, and 2 decades of practice. The major asked if the approach could be taught to other soldiers. Matthias said no, not really, Because the rifle was custom and irreplaceable, the ammunition was hand-loaded, and he had perhaps 50 rounds remaining, and the skills took years to develop. The major looked disappointed, but thanked him and dismissed him. Matthias walked back to his position through a forest that no longer looked like a forest, past soldiers who no longer looked like the men he'd trained with months earlier, and felt nothing but a vast, aching emptiness. The American offensive broke through 3 days later, not through Matthias's sector, but through a weaker position to the south where German defenses had been ground down by relentless artillery and overwhelming infantry numbers. The withdrawal order came at night, and Matthias's unit retreated eastward through snow and freezing rain, abandoning positions they bled to hold, falling back toward Germany itself and toward defeat that everyone could feel approaching but nobody dared speak aloud. During that withdrawal, Matthias's hunting rifle, the weapon that had killed 36 men and delayed an American offensive for nearly 2 months, broke. The bolt lug sheared off during a firefight when Matthias was engaging American pursuit elements. The metal fatigued beyond its limits by months of hard use and temperature extremes it had never been designed to endure. The rifle became instantly useless, and Matthias threw it into a river rather than let it be captured. He finished the war carrying a standard K98K like every other German infantryman, no longer exceptional, no longer the hunter, just another exhausted soldier in a defeated army trying to survive until the surrender that came in May 1945. After the war, Matthias returned to the Schwarzwald and resumed his work as a forester. He never spoke about what he'd done in the Vosges, never told stories, never acknowledged the Iron Cross that arrived in the Mayo months after surrender. His wife knew something terrible had happened to him during those months, but she didn't ask and he didn't volunteer. He threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, spending long days alone in the forest, managing timber operations, tracking game populations, and slowly, imperceptibly, trying to reconcile the man he'd been before the war with the man he'd become during it. He never hunted again. The rifles he'd cherished before the war remained in their cabinet, cleaned and maintained but never fired. When his son asked to learn to shoot in the 1950s, Matthias taught him with a patience and thoroughness that surprised his wife, but he never explained why marksmanship mattered or what it had meant in his own life. He died in 1983, and his obituary mentioned his career as a forester and his service in the war, but provided no details about either. The story of Matthias Brenner and his civilian rifle wasn't unique in the sense that many soldiers on all sides of World War II used personal weapons when they were superior to issued equipment and when commanders were pragmatic enough to allow it. But it was unique in what it revealed about the relationship between skill, equipment, and effectiveness in modern warfare. The German military in World War II was generally well-equipped and well-trained, but it was also constrained by the same logistical and industrial limitations that affected all combatants. Standardization was necessary for supplying millions of soldiers across thousands of miles of front lines. Custom weapons built to individual specifications were impossible to produce and maintain at scale. But in localized situations where a single skilled individual with superior equipment could achieve disproportionate effects, the rigid adherence to standardization became a liability rather than an asset. Matthias's hunting rifle wasn't better than AK-98K because it was more powerful or more reliable. It was better because it was more precise, and precision in the hands of a skilled marksman could achieve effects that volume of fire from standard infantry weapons could not. The tactical implications were significant, but went largely unrecognized by German high command, which by late 1944 was focused on strategic collapse rather than tactical innovation. A single skilled marksman with appropriate equipment could degrade enemy reconnaissance, delay enemy advances, and force enemy forces to operate more cautiously and less effectively. The cost of achieving this effect was minimal: one rifle, one soldier, and ammunition that could be produced by hand if necessary. The benefit was substantial: degraded enemy intelligence, delayed enemy operations, and improved survival rates for friendly forces in the affected sector. But scaling this approach would have required identifying soldiers with appropriate skills, providing them with appropriate weapons, and integrating them into defensive doctrine in ways that Wehrmacht training and organization didn't support. By the time Matthias demonstrated what was possible, Germany lacked the time, resources, and institutional capacity to adapt even if commanders had recognized the value of adaptation. The psychological dimension of Matthias' story is equally significant and more universal. Every soldier who kills in combat faces some version of the moral and psychological burden that Matthias carried. The distance between killer and killed matters enormously. Artillery crews and bomber pilots can kill hundreds or thousands while remaining psychologically insulated by distance and abstraction. Infantry in close combat face the immediate, visceral reality of killing, but often act in the chaos of mutual violence where survival instinct overrides reflection. Snipers and designated marksmen occupy an uncomfortable middle ground. They kill deliberately at sufficient distance to observe their targets as individual human beings, with enough time before and after each shot to fully comprehend what they're doing. This requires a psychological compartmentalization that some men achieve easily, some achieve with difficulty, and some never achieve at all. Matthias fell into the middle category. He was capable of killing with precision and efficiency when tactical necessity demanded it, but each kill extracted a psychological cost that accumulated over time and that he never fully reconciled. The technology that made Matthias effective was almost primitive by modern standards. His hunting rifle was a manually operated bolt-action weapon using technology that dated to the 1890s. His optics were simple iron sights without magnification. His ranging method relied on visual estimation and experience rather than laser rangefinders or ballistic computers. Yet in his hands, with his skills, this primitive technology achieved effects that would be impressive even with modern equipment. This suggests something important about the relationship between human skill and technological capability. Technology can amplify skill, but it cannot replace it. A mediocre shooter with a modern precision rifle and advanced optics will never match an expert shooter with basic equipment. Conversely, an expert shooter with modern equipment becomes capable of effects that seem almost superhuman. The lesson, relevant in any domain where human performance matters, is that investment in skill development often provides greater returns than investment in technology alone, and that the combination of high skill and appropriate technology produces multiplicative rather than additive effects. The moral complexity of Matthias' story resists simple conclusions. He killed 36 men. Possibly more probable kills are included, all of them in service of a regime and a cause that history has rightly judged as monstrous. Does this make his actions evil regardless of his personal beliefs or motivations? Or does the context of defensive warfare, where he was killing enemy soldiers attempting to kill German soldiers, provide some moral justification? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Matthias himself seemed to struggle with them, and his post-war withdrawal from activities that reminded him of the war suggests he never reached conclusions that satisfied his conscience. What seems clear is that he was an ordinary man with extraordinary skills placed in a situation where those skills became lethal, and the exercise of those skills exacted a psychological price that he carried for the rest of his life. The broader lesson from Matthias Brenner's story isn't about sniping or marksmanship, or even warfare specifically. It's about what happens when skill, necessity, and opportunity converge. Matthias spent 20 years developing capabilities that had no military purpose, no grand design behind them, nothing more than the practical requirements of his profession and the personal satisfaction of mastering a difficult skill. When war came and necessity demanded, those capabilities suddenly became militarily significant in ways nobody had anticipated or planned for. This pattern repeats throughout history. Individuals with specialized skills developed in civilian contexts find themselves in situations where those skills have unexpected applications and achieve disproportionate effects. The forester becomes a sniper. The radio operator becomes an innovator. The mechanic becomes a tank ace. The implication is that human capital, the accumulated skills and knowledge that individuals possess, is often undervalued and underutilized by institutions that focus on standardization and scalability rather than recognizing and leveraging exceptional individual capabilities. Matthias Brenner's story also speaks to the distance between official history and lived reality. Official Wehrmacht records from the Vosges campaign mention the defensive actions, the casualties, the withdrawals, but they don't mention a forester with a hunting rifle who killed 36 Americans and delayed an offensive. American records from the same campaign mention the difficult terrain, the stubborn German resistance, the casualties from German small arms fire, but they don't identify Matthias or recognize the disproportionate effect one skilled rifleman achieved. The history of the Vosges campaign, as written in official accounts and academic studies, is a story of divisions and regiments, of grand tactics and strategic objectives, of forces and terrain. The story of Matthias Brenner exists in the gaps between official history, preserved not in archives but in the fading memories of survivors and the oral traditions of units that no longer exist. This is true of countless individual stories from every war. The official history captures the large-scale patterns but misses the human details, the individual innovations, the personal costs that collectively shaped outcomes but that didn't fit into neat organizational charts or operational summaries. In the end, the story of Matthias Brenner and his civilian rifle is a story about limits and their transcendence. The limits of standard equipment, transcended by superior craftsmanship. The limits of doctrine, transcended by individual initiative. The limits of expected performance, transcended by exceptional skill. But also the limits of human endurance. The psychological boundaries that combat pushes against until something breaks that can never be fully repaired. Matthias achieved the impossible by any reasonable standard. He took a hunting rifle designed for deer and used it to kill 36 enemy soldiers at ranges where he shouldn't have been able to hit anything, delaying an enemy offensive and saving countless lives on his own side. The cost was measured not in ammunition expended or equipment worn out, but in something far more valuable and irreplaceable, a portion of his humanity that he spent in those frozen mountains and that he never recovered. Whether that expenditure was worthwhile, whether the tactical gains justified the personal cost, is a question that Matthias carried to his grave and that anyone who considers the story must answer for themselves. The civilian rifle that killed 36 Germans ended its service in a river in eastern France. Broken and discarded, its brief moment of military significance concluded. The man who'd wielded it lived another 38 years, outwardly ordinary, inwardly marked by experiences he can neither fully accept nor completely reject. There was no glory in his story, no triumphant conclusion, just the quiet tragedy of a decent man doing terrible things because circumstances demanded it, and then living with the consequences in whatever way he could manage. That, perhaps more than the tactical details or the impressive kill count, is what makes his story worth remembering. Not because it celebrates war or killing, but because it illustrates with stark clarity the human cost of warfare, even for those who survive it, and the distance between the capabilities we develop and the purposes to which they're sometimes applied. Subscribe for more untold stories from history that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary